So 12 of the most liberal cities in the entire US just told the Supreme Court to uphold New York's restrictions on concealed carry permits. So let's talk about this. But real quick before we jump into this video, if you think that the government and states need to stop infringing on your Second Amendment rights, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. I also want to give a shout out to one of the main sponsors of the channel, and that is USCCA. Through your membership, you get training, education, and self-defense liability protection. So if you carry a firearm, I highly recommend you take a look into USCCA, and I'll put a link to them down in the details section. Also, I want to let you know that this content is powered by the Firearms Policy Coalition. So head on over to joinfpc.org to help support the Second Amendment cause. Thank you again, Firearms Policy Coalition, for supporting this channel. So like I said in the intro, 12 of the most liberal cities in the entire US just filed a brief to the Supreme Court in the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Corlett case / Bruen case, which deals with the state of New York's restrictions on concealed carry permits. Now, some quick background on this case if you're not familiar with what's going on. This case is a challenge to the state of New York's concealed carry permit requirements. The state requires a person to provide proper cause to be issued a permit to carry concealed out in public. However, they do not treat self-defense as a proper cause or justification for someone to be issued a permit. Instead, the reason for wanting a license has to be something more significant than just self-defense. Essentially, this led to only the elite and well-connected within the areas to be able to be granted licenses to carry concealed. This New York scheme is now up for review in the Supreme Court and essentially is being challenged, and oral arguments will take place on November 3rd of 2021. Now, the question presented to the Supreme Court to consider is whether the state of New York's denial of petitioners' applications for concealed carry licenses for self-defense violated the Second Amendment. So that is the question which the Supreme Court will be addressing. And here you have 12 of the most liberal cities in the entire US filing a brief in support of the state of New York and in support of the state of New York's position that their scheme, that their restrictions on concealed carry permits is valid. These 12 cities include Chicago, Baltimore, Cincinnati, Columbus, Dayton, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Portland, San Diego, San Francisco, Seattle, and St. Paul. So those are the cities that got together to argue to the Supreme Court that what the state of New York is doing here is legitimate. Now let's take a look at some of the arguments that these cities put forward. So these cities state that local governments have no greater purpose than to suppress violent crime and therefore protect their citizens. Firearms, particularly concealable handguns, can frustrate that purpose. Now more than ever, local governments need maximum flexibility in addressing the carrying of firearms. New York's licensing scheme is the sort of effort needed to combat firearms violence. Chicago's history is instructive. Under state and local law, Chicago has enforced requirements for the concealed carry of firearms, prohibitions on carrying in sensitive places, and an assault weapons ban, among other firearms restrictions. They go on to state that these laws have produced positive results, but a crisis of deaths due to gun violence continues. Now let's pause right here. Chicago and these other liberal cities are actually trying to argue to the Supreme Court that their restrictive gun laws are effective, when in reality, we all know that these cities are plagued with the highest crime rates despite all these gun control laws that they keep getting passed and keep instituting. But despite all this, what they are arguing to the Supreme Court is that these gun control laws have been effective and that they have been effective in reducing crime. They go on to state that tragically in these cities and other urban communities, gun violence is increasing. Shootings occur at schools, parks, streets, sidewalks, and entertainment venues. Public officials are possible targets, while the threat of law enforcement personnel is ever present. To combat this scourge of gun violence, local governments enact a variety of requirements tailored to their own circumstances. Local governments need broad discretion in establishing local standards regarding firearms. The Second Amendment does not bar states and local governments from experimenting with stringent firearms regulations when warranted. They conclude by saying New York's duly enacted licensing scheme should be upheld. Now that's the general interest that these cities put forward of why they can file this amicus brief to the Supreme Court. They then have the audacity to state in their brief that crime is continuing to rise in their cities, especially over the last year during the pandemic. And of course, they are blaming all of these issues on the firearms themselves. They argue that the rise in firearms violence makes it all the more important to allow states and local governments maximum flexibility to enact and enforce firearms regulations, so long as a firearms regulation leaves open an appropriate avenue for qualified law-abiding citizens to exercise Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms for self-defense. Local governments should therefore be given wide discretion in their initiatives to end firearms violence. New York's licensing scheme, they argue, is one example of good firearms restrictions that are beneficial, and then they argue that there are other jurisdictions and cities that have other regulations and enforcement mechanisms in place as well. Then in the brief, they go on in talking about how Chicago is a model of how well firearms restrictions actually work, which again is very laughable. Chicago is not at all a shining example of how to decrease crime or how to put in place gun restrictions and gun control laws to decrease crime. Chicago is actually an example of how all these restrictions do absolutely nothing. Chicago is rampant with crime, and they have not been effective in addressing these issues whatsoever. After this section, they go on to argue that local governments should be given broad discretion in restricting access to firearms because that's in the best interest of public health and safety. This amounts to an argument of the cities saying to the Supreme Court that because they have a compelling governmental interest in stopping crime, they should be allowed to put in place any gun control laws and any restrictions they want pretty much at their broad discretion. The Supreme Court should just greenlight whatever they have because they have a compelling government interest. But that's not how constitutional rights work. Even using tiered scrutiny, which the government often advocates for in their restrictions, a law that restricts a constitutional right, here bearing firearms in public for self-defense, that restriction must be narrowly tailored to meet that compelling governmental interest. AKA, that's a strict scrutiny standard, even if you're using tier-based scrutiny, which isn't even the appropriate type of analysis, but even using tier-based scrutiny, strict scrutiny would apply. And an outright ban on people carrying firearms for self-defense is not narrowly tailored, and that's exactly what the state of New York is doing here. They are just outright denying carry permits based on the rationale or justification for self-defense. An outright ban or an outright denial is not narrowly tailored in any form. These 12 cities then close out their arguments by saying that New York's discretionary licensing scheme is the sort of constitutional experimentation needed to combat firearms violence in these cities. They argue in this section of their brief that cities and states are allowed to experiment with different laws and policies which restrict access to firearms, and that these would not violate constitutional rights. So as you can see, this brief is pretty absurd in what it's arguing, and the whole brief can be summarized as these 12 cities saying, we do similar things, it's so effective here in these liberal cities, Supreme Court, you should greenlight it. When the reality is, these gun control measures, these gun control restrictions, these firearms restrictions have absolutely just failed in these cities. And when you look at these large liberal cities, these policies have had zero effect. In fact, crime rates are so high in these cities like Chicago. So we will be waiting to see how some of these issues are addressed by the Supreme Court. And like I said, oral arguments in that case will happen on November 3rd. And also for those of you who are interested in watching the arguments live with me, make sure you're subscribed to my second YouTube channel. That's where I will be doing live streams and also where I will be posting the podcast episodes. So if you want to watch along with me live, that's where I will be doing that. And I will leave links down to that channel in the description section. Also will be pinned in the comment if you want to go subscribe over to there. So you make sure that you watch those live streams with me, or if you want to listen to the podcast. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and comment down below and I'll try to answer the best of my ability. Also, if you like this video and like support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm or fuel Algore's rhythm. It signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos, in this type of two-way news, and then it pushes it to more people. So thank you so much to everybody who's liked, commented, subscribed, who's hit the notification bell. Also, just double check to make sure you're still subscribed, because YouTube sometimes unsubscribes people. So just double check that. And also, if you're a new subscriber, make sure you comment down below that you're a new subscriber, and I'll make sure I comment back to you. So as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and never forget, the station was built by armed scholars, and the station will be maintained by armed scholars.